is Daniel Adibi, and I'll be your host for Our World 101, the show in which we explain complicated, real-world events and issues to bridge people together. Today's topic is the LGBTQ plus community. Throughout history, this community has faced strong and often violent discrimination, and today this community continues to face discrimination and bias in the healthcare, education, and criminal justice systems. Here to talk to us today about the LGBTQ plus community is activist Brian Johnson, who is the CEO of Equality Illinois. Equality Illinois is a nonprofit organization with the goals of delivering power to the LGBTQ plus community and passing pro-LGBTQ legislation. He's also the author of an exciting new book, Our Fair Share, and he has dedicated his life to ending discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. So, Mr. Johnson, welcome to the show. We are really excited to have you here.
Daniel, I am really honored that you invited me. Thank you.
So to start off, what prompted your activism in the LGBTQ plus community?
You know, for 20 years after I graduated from college, I didn't work in the LGBTQ civil rights space professionally. I was a teacher, I was a school leader. I'd really been working in public education. And then in around 2015, 2016, three things were coming together in my life. One is I was preparing for my own wedding. My husband and I were getting married, and that rite felt really fragile because it was so new. I was caught off guard by the speed and the vitriol of the backlash against marriage equality across the country. When the Supreme Court handed down the decision for marriage equality, within a single year, 202 bills were introduced in state legislatures across the country trying to cut back on that right. And number three is I was really concerned about the rising complacency I saw among a lot of LGBTQ leaders saying, now that we have marriage, I think we might be done. And all those things were making me very nervous. And so when my predecessor at Equality Illinois, who had led the organization very successfully through the marriage fight here, announced he was leaving, I had a couple board members who knew about my work in social justice space who encouraged me to apply. And I went ahead and I did it. And I wasn't even sure I was going to go through the interview process or take the job. But lo and behold, I did. And I started in June of 2016.
And what is your role in Equality Illinois?
Yeah, so I serve as the CEO. So I get the great opportunity to work across all of our work streams. So as you mentioned, our big three priorities are to pass pro-LGBTQ legislation, to ensure LGBTQ communities across the state, wherever we live, have civic power. And we also work additionally to try to get LGBTQ people into positions of public leadership. So joining boards and commissions and things like that. And so I get the incredible privilege of working with our board, our community advisory group, our staff, and all of our stakeholders to make sure all of that work gets done.
Yeah, and it's really amazing what you're doing there. You're doing so much to help end the discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community, and we need organizations like yours to help fight for justice.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. So I remember watching an eye-opening video posted by Equality Illinois that just shows how pervasive inequality is towards the LGBTQ plus community, and mostly in the healthcare, education, and criminal justice systems. Can you comment briefly on how discrimination is affecting these systems?
Sure. When I started in the role in the summer of 2016, I went around and had 250 conversations with LGBTQ Illinoisans and our allies in small group and one-on-one settings. I went all the way down to the Kentucky-Illinois border. I went over to the towns on the Mississippi River. I went as far north as towns on the Wisconsin-Illinois border. I went, throughout the neighborhoods in Chicago. And I just asked the question that Ruby Sales, the civil rights leader, used to ask in her work, which is, where does it hurt? Right? I asked, when have you been discriminated against? What are you proud of? I asked, what are you afraid of? What are you hopeful for? And I just collected these stories. And even in the summer of 2016, right, we didn't know about what the election of 2016 was going to look like at that point. We had just come off of marriage. Even at that time, when our community was feeling more hopeful than I think we had ever felt as a community up to that point, we just heard stories over and over again about our discrimination in those key settings that you talked about, Daniel. So in schools, we talked about young people being, not affirmed in their identity or even being shamed and stigmatized. And then when we looked at the research and saw this research is a little bit old, but a third of all Illinois public school students would hear an anti-gay or an anti-trans statement from a staff member over the course of their career in public schools, right? Those stories just made sense when we saw that data. When we looked at criminal justice, we heard stories about people being treated poorly by police, and then if they were in the criminal justice system and housed in it, that they were being disrespected. And then we saw the data, right? 20% of all young people, for example, caught up in the criminal justice system nationwide, 20% identify as LGBTQ. So we know we're overrepresented in that population. Right? When we looked at healthcare, we heard, horrible stories about people being mistreated by their doctors, being misgendered, being refused to get service or respected. And then we looked at the data and we saw LGBTQ people and those living with HIV were disproportionately relying on things like the Affordable Care Act for their healthcare services. And at that point that those medical services were in jeopardy. So we kind of heard all of these things. And for us, it was such an important reminder that when you pair looking at research with collecting real stories from people living their experiences, you can get a really rich picture of what the needs and hopes of a community are.
Yeah, and this obviously needs to end because nobody should have to face that kind of discrimination.
Totally.
I remember I read that there were at least 8 anti-LGBTQ plus bills enacted into law this year, and another 10 are waiting to be signed. Over 250 of these bills have been introduced to state legislators in just 2021. And looking through the list of the bills, I saw that many of them don't allow transgender students to participate in sports. They also deny good access to healthcare for LGBTQ plus individuals. And other bills also allow for discrimination against the community and ban discussion of issues surrounding the community in classrooms. It must be really hard for someone like you who's an activist. How do you maintain your optimism knowing all of this?
My optimism comes from our community. I have a friend of mine in the community who gave a speech once where she talked about queer magic. And I love that, right? I get to work with a community every day, Daniel, that is incredibly resilient, that is vibrant, that is colorful, that is bringing their best selves to their personal and professional lives, even in the face of incredible opposition and discrimination. I just know that our world is a better place when LGBTQ people can be allowed to live their full selves in an affirmed, equitable, and respected way out in public. And that possibility, the excitement that not only can my community be their best selves in public, but that the rest of society, the rest of America could benefit from that is incredibly, incredibly moving to me. I'll also say, we've talked about this, Daniel, but I have a 3-year-old daughter now. And the idea that I could help create a world in which whoever she ends up being will be respected and affirmed, and certainly a world in which the family that she was raised in would be respected and affirmed is incredibly motivating to me.
Yeah, and those are really, really powerful words. Thank you for sharing that. Despite all of the anti-LGBTQ plus bills, what legislation has been passed recently that you feel hopeful about? And are there any bills that you are currently fighting for?
In Illinois, we really, really proud to pass a bill a couple of years ago that we called the Inclusive Curriculum Act. This bill at that time was the second bill of its type introduced in the country nationwide. It's now, the last time I checked, one of only a handful of states that has it. And what it does, Daniel, is it basically says you have to teach the contributions of LGBTQ people in American history. One of the challenges for the LGBTQ community is that we're rare, not unique, but rare among historically marginalized groups, and that we're not often born into ourselves. And what I mean by that is most of us are born into families and to parents that are straight and cisgender. So we don't get to learn about our history, from a way that is passed down from generations before us. We have to learn about our community from the same way everybody learns about our community, from schools and publicly available information. And yet for too long, what has happened is the LGBTQ identities of great Americans has been scrubbed from history. So maybe you learn that Jane Addams was the first American woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize, but you didn't learn that she was a lesbian. Or maybe you learn that Sally Ride was the first American woman to go into space, but you didn't learn she was a lesbian. Maybe you learn that Alan Turing is the father of computer coding, but you didn't learn that he was a gay man. And so what happens is, and I should say in contrast, if somebody is straight or cisgender, you learn that all the time. Like we know who Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife was, Coretta. We know who Abraham Lincoln's wife was, right? That was Mary Todd Lincoln. So we have this habit in American history of teaching about straight and cis people's identity, but totally ignoring LGBTQ people's identity. And it gave all students, not just young queer people, it gave all students a skewed view of who LGBTQ people are, how long we've been in our country and in society, and how important we've been to our history. And so this bill, which is now in law, is going to mean that when my daughter goes to kindergarten, she's going to go to school in a state that will acknowledge who we have been as LGBTQ people and our amazing contributions to history. And I think for young queer people, that's going to give them role models to look up to. That is really exciting and help engender a sense of pride in who we can be. And for straight and cisgender young people, it's going to help them to understand how diverse people in history have been and how many different types of people made positive contributions to who we've become as a country. And so I think I'm most excited about that. On the forefront and kind of coming up, we're working on a bill that is now law that would require that whenever a school district teaches about personal health and safety education, that they do so in a way that is also LGBTQ affirming and respectful. And I'm excited to continue to work to make sure that every district is required to teach personal health and safety education in a way that honors LGBTQ young people.
Yeah, and it's obviously so important to teach about the contributions of LGBTQ plus people because right now, not many people know about it, and it's really something that we need to teach.
Totally. I agree. I think we'd be a prouder country if we're more aware of how many LGBTQ people have helped make us the vibrant, dynamic, wonderful country we are today.
So the Equality Act is supposed to provide protection from discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity by amending the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And many lawmakers oppose this act, saying that it infringes on their religious beliefs. Can you give us some background on this act and tell us the current status of it? Do you think it will be passed?
Sure. Before I talk about the status of that bill, let me just kind of lay the landscape of kind of what the current state of the world is right now, right? Until the summer of 2020, in most places in this country, it was totally legal to fire somebody simply because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, right? They could be the greatest performer out there and be doing everything, but they could be fired simply if you found out that they were gay, lesbian, or trans. And then, when the Supreme Court made the decision in Bostock versus Clayton County in 2020, we extended protections in the limited area of employment. But if you go broadly outside of that, we live in a place that is, patchwork quilt of protections for LGBTQ people. So what that means is I can never be sure, given what state I'm in, how protected I'm going to be against discrimination in public accommodations and trying to seek credit and trying to get access to a jury if I were to move, things like this. And to give you a concrete example, my husband and I travel whenever we leave the state with our daughter, with a red folder that says Josephine Travel. And it has all her documents in there, copy of her birth certificate, copy of her adoption order, proof that we are a family. And we do that because we never know when we're going to be in a particular state, how protected, how affirmed, and how recognized we will be as a family. That is a horrible place to be, right? No American family should feel like they have to travel with documentation to ensure that they could be protected. And so what the Equality Act seeks to do is say, particularly in public accommodations and in employment, but also a wide range of other areas, that you shouldn't be discriminated against because you're LGBTQ. And what that would do is that would ensure all of us, no matter where we are in the country, where we live, where we travel, that we can be guaranteed basic levels of protections. So you're right. It has passed the House. A version of it has passed the House in 2 different years, but it has stalled in the Senate both times. It is hard to see how it will be passed if the filibuster is in place. Even if you could get strong Democratic support and a few Republican senators, it's hard to see how we get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate right now without incredible pressure on particularly Republican senators on this. For those that say recognizing the full humanity of LGBTQ people offends their religious freedom, I simply say we already have the First Amendment in this country. People's religious freedoms and their right to worship as they see fit and as they please are totally protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. The question is, when you go out into the public square and interact with others, how many of your beliefs and biases and restrictions are you legally required to bring into the public square? So if you belong to a religion that dehumanizes people of color, you are not allowed to kick people of color outside of your hotel because of that religious belief, right? If you belong to a religion that says you don't believe women should drive, if you are someone who holds that belief and you are working in the DMV, you can't deny women, accesses to licenses to drive. And so what I simply say is everybody in America has their religious freedom. They can belong to religions and communities of faith that allow them to practice as they see fit. But that does not give you a license to discriminate against people willy-nilly in this country in the public setting.
Yeah, and as you said, nobody should have to worry about their protection or worrying about being fired just because of who they are. It's just not right.
That's right.
And then there was also another act that is similar to the Equality Act, but it would provide religious exemptions, and it's called the Fairness for All Act. And it's supposed to balance religious freedom with LGBTQ plus rights. Can you explain that in a little bit more depth?
Sure. So we don't use religious freedoms on our side. We call it licenses to discriminate. And the reason is we just have to call it what it is. It's these laws would give affirmative permission for people to discriminate so long as you can say it's tied to your religious beliefs, right? And so there are some protections that the Fairness for All Act would provide, but it would carve out and say, look, if you're a college, if you're a university, if you're a small business, you can discriminate as you see fit. And we simply think that is unjust, right? Look, if you are a house of worship, and in that house of worship, you do not want to, allow for membership in your house of worship to LGBTQ people, if you don't want to perform same-sex weddings, if you don't want to acknowledge the inherent dignity of queer families, that is totally fine. But when you leave the 4 walls of those institutions and you move out into public square, you are bound by the same sets of laws that are generally applicable to everybody in America. And so, if you as a religious institution want to begin facilitating adoptions, if you as a religious institution, want to employ people outside of ministry, to work your grounds or to maybe run a coffee shop that you're affiliated with, the general laws that apply to everybody in America should also apply to you. And simply because you can say that you have a religious belief against treating people equally does not grant you a license to discriminate in this country. It doesn't on any other dimension of someone's identity, and we shouldn't grant licenses to discriminate against LGBTQ people.
Yeah, and obviously this discrimination against LGBTQ plus people has to stop.
Totally.
As you said, it's just, as I said before, it's just not right. So I heard the exciting news that your book, Our Fair Share, is finished. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, so this is something deeply informed by my work in LGBTQ activism, but in a bit of another direction. So Our Fair Share really tries to tackle economic inequality in this country. One thing I've come across over the past couple of years is just seeing how much inequality we have and how different it's been than levels of inequality we've seen for over a century, right? For the bottom half of workers in America have not received a real increase in their wages in over 40 years. Whereas in the 1960s, CEOs used to make 20 times what their average workers make. Now they make nearly 300 times what the average worker makes. This is a level of inequality that we've not seen since the 1920s. And what's disturbing to me is that runs so counter to our truest American self, right? The great promise of America is that we can come together across all of our differences to forge a common future. Like that's what our founders gave us. Even in all, the brokenness of their times, they laid out this path that says, we're not going to form a country based on common race or common, country of origin or common church or common language. We're going to form this country that says, like, we will come together to collaborate and to form something that is unique on the world stage. And when we have an economy that is pulling us apart at a rate we haven't seen in a century, that economy flies in the front of our greatest American story. And so I propose in Our Fair Share that we need to begin thinking about how to create economic rules and structures that tie us more closely together, that link us more tightly to American values. So one thing I propose is something called a citizen dividend, which is a requirement that every business that turns a profit returns some of that profit to the American public every year in the form of a dividend payment. In recognition that, look, as I say, 95% of what goes into making a business successful is hard work and strategy and risk taking by the work of on the part of the labor and managers of a business. But some part of what went into that profit is wealth we all own together. Our natural resources, our infrastructure, our roads, our energy, our education, our inherited systems like our Constitution and our courts and our IP system, our patent system. And so when you use somebody else's wealth in our country to turn a profit, you owe part of that profit back to the owners of that wealth. And so my hope is that with a citizen dividend, with an honest recognition that every American is a part owner of our American prosperity, we can begin to reclaim our greatest American motto that out of many, we are one, a recognition that we truly do belong to each other.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. We need an economy that brings us together instead of one that pulls us apart.
Absolutely, and we can reclaim our American values in our economy if we're willing to think boldly and do things differently.
I read an article that you wrote for The Advocate that was inspiring and heartwarming, and it described you coming out in the context of being a father, and it described some parallels that you drew between you and your daughter, who was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. It was a story of resilience and hope. Can you describe the article in a little more depth to our viewers?
Sure. So our daughter Josephine, who's 3 years old, has cerebral palsy. That means that she had a stroke when she was in utero in the womb, and that part of her body, her right side of her body, will just be slightly harder for her to use as she grows up. That diagnosis was not immediately apparent when she was born or young, but as she began to develop as a young person, we began to see signs that she might have a neurological condition. And sure enough, she was diagnosed a couple months ago. As we were prepping for that diagnosis, and I was thinking about all the negative images that the world gives about people living with disabilities, and particularly people living with cerebral palsy, I had this moment of insight that when I was coming out 25 years ago in my own life, into my family, thought about all the negative images that were given around gay people. We were discriminated against, we were violently attacked, we were not denied legal families. And I imagine that my parents, when I came out, would have been very worried for me because of all those negative images. And it hit me that I didn't have to choose to buy in to all the negative images that the world was going to give me about Joey's diagnosis with cerebral palsy. That I could choose instead to look at the wonderful joys that might flow from it. Just like in my life, being gay has led me to my husband and my daughter and work I find meaningful. Maybe her cerebral palsy diagnosis will lead her to a host of joyful outcomes that we might not see at this point. Maybe it'll connect her to a network of people where she finds deep friendships and true love. Maybe it's going to inspire her to go into a medical field to support others with cerebral palsy. Maybe it'll give her voice to be an actor or a writer or an artist that expresses her life with cerebral palsy. And so we decided, look, we're going to be honest about the challenges that she faces, but we're also going to be very purposeful about holding room for joy and allow ourselves to be open to all the joyful possibilities that may flow because of her diagnosis.
Yeah, and I just want the article was really, really beautifully written. And one sentence that really stuck out to me was I'm just going to read it. It was what I learned, what I know now is to make room for the joy. And that sentence really resonated with me because it just says that we have to carve out our own happiness despite what others do to bring us down. And I really think those are powerful words.
Yeah, thank you. You know, when the world and our country will try to tell us that the ways we're different from the norm are things we should be ashamed of and will give us a lifetime of struggle. And I just have not found that to be the complete story. Yes, there is struggle and there are challenges, and I don't want to deny that. But that is not our whole story for those of us born outside the norm. And I think that for those of us who are different in the many, many ways in which we're all different, it is incumbent upon us to say we are beautiful and powerful and magical. And we're going to own that and create space for that.
Yeah. What can we do as individuals to help fight for LGBTQ plus rights?
I think the biggest thing one can do is to remain curious, to ask questions, Daniel, like you have. If you have LGBTQ people in your network, not presume that there's a right way to be an ally, because to be an ally is going to be different for every person. And I think, to really seek to understand the unique experiences and to ask the people in your life who you care about how you can show up for them in a way that will make a difference and honors and respect their experience.
And is there any message that you'd like to tell kids my age?
Yeah, I would. I think I would say stay curious. I think one of the most dangerous things in the world is to look at new situations from certainty and conclusion. So stay curious. I will also say the critical role that young people play is to ask two key questions. Do you not see, and are you not angry? And so when you see things in the world that you feel like those around you are complacent to, and those in power and the adults around you are not paying attention to, don't be afraid to ask those questions, even of very powerful people in your life. Do you not see, and are you not angry?
So yeah, we have to ask questions, and then those will shape our future, because curiosity will lead to making changes, and then that will lead to justice.
That's right. I agree.
All right. Well, we've had a great discussion. We talked about Equality Illinois. We've talked about some current LGBTQ legislation, and we talked about your exciting new book. Mr. Johnson, it was really, really great having you on the show. I just wanted to thank you for being a role model for someone my age. And I think that your bravery for fighting for what's right is really inspiring.
Daniel, thank you. It was the highlight of my week. I was so honored that you invited me to come on.
Yeah, it was really a great experience talking to you.
Thank you.